Imagine being accused of a crime. Not proven guilty, not convicted, simply accused. Now imagine your punishment is being buried alive, dragged through the streets, or forced to prove your innocence by surviving an impossible test. This isn't fantasy. This isn't fiction. These were real punishments used throughout the Middle Ages. And for the people who lived back then, this was justice. Today we're exploring some of the most brutal medieval punishments that actually existed. And trust me, some are far worse than you think. When people imagine the Middle Ages, they often think of castles, knights, and kings. But medieval life was far harsher than most of us realize. There were no modern police, no forensic science, no reliable legal protections. And punishments were designed for one purpose: fear. Authorities wanted punishment to be public, memorable, and terrifying enough to discourage anyone from breaking the law. Let's begin. Trial by ordeal. Imagine being accused of theft. Instead of examining evidence, a judge orders you to place your hand into boiling water or carry a red-hot piece of iron. If your wounds healed properly after several days, God had declared you innocent. If they became infected, you were guilty. This practice was known as trial by ordeal. The idea was simple: God would protect the innocent and punish the guilty. Thousands of people across medieval Europe were subjected to these tests. Today it sounds absurd, but for centuries, many believed divine intervention was a perfectly reasonable legal system. The pillory. At first glance, the pillory doesn't sound that terrible. A wooden frame locked around your head and hands. No torture, no execution, just public humiliation. Except humiliation was only the beginning. People trapped in the pillory could remain there for hours or even days. Crowds gathered around them, throwing rotten food, mud, animal waste, sometimes stones. What began as humiliation could quickly become deadly. For many victims, the crowd itself became the punishment. The stocks. Similar to the pillory were the stocks. This time your feet were locked into place. You couldn't escape. You couldn't defend yourself. And everyone passing by knew exactly why you were there. The punishment was designed to destroy your reputation. In small medieval towns, public shame could ruin a person's entire life. Sometimes that damage lasted longer than any physical injury. Scold's Bridle. One of the most disturbing punishments was the Scold's Bridle, an iron cage placed over the head. Inside was a metal plate designed to press against the tongue. The punishment was often used against people accused of gossiping, arguing, or speaking too much, particularly women. Victims were sometimes paraded through town while wearing the device, unable to speak, unable to defend themselves. It served as both punishment and public warning. Remain silent, or suffer the consequences. The Ducking Stool. For people accused of disorderly behavior, another punishment awaited: the Ducking Stool. The accused was strapped to a chair attached to a long wooden beam, then lowered into a river or pond, again and again and again. The purpose wasn't necessarily to kill. It was to humiliate. But accidents happened, and not everyone survived. For spectators, it was entertainment. For the victim, it was terror. Drawing and quartering. Now we move into punishments reserved for the most serious crimes, particularly treason. drawing, and quartering became one of the most feared punishments in medieval England. The condemned person was dragged through the streets to the execution site, then subjected to a brutal execution. After death, the body was divided into multiple parts. These remains were often displayed publicly. The message was clear: this is what happens to those who betray the crown. The punishment wasn't just for the victim, it was for everyone watching. The breaking wheel. The breaking wheel was used in parts of Europe for particularly severe crimes. Victims were tied to a large wooden wheel. Executioners then shattered bones using heavy blows. Sometimes death came quickly, sometimes it did not. The wheel often remained on public display afterward, a warning visible to anyone entering the town. Justice, in the medieval world, was often designed to be seen. Burial alive. Perhaps one of the most terrifying punishments was exactly what it sounds like: burial alive. Although relatively rare, records exist describing cases where individuals were buried beneath the earth as punishment. For many people, the fear of being buried alive became one of the greatest nightmares of the medieval imagination. It represented complete helplessness, no escape, no rescue, only darkness. Why were punishments so brutal? The question is obvious. Why? Why were medieval punishments so cruel? Part of the answer lies in fear. Governments had limited power. Law enforcement barely existed. Most people would never encounter a police officer because police forces as we know them didn't exist. Instead, rulers relied on public spectacle. Punishments needed to be unforgettable. The more frightening the punishment appeared, the more effective authorities believed it would be. Whether it actually prevented crime is another question entirely. Looking back, medieval punishments seem impossible to imagine. Cruel, brutal, sometimes irrational. But to the people who lived in that world, they represented order, justice, and control. The Middle Ages were not an age of fairness. They were an age of fear. And nowhere is that more obvious than in the punishments people were forced to endure. The next time someone tells you they'd love to live in medieval times, remember this: the castles were real, the knights were real, and so were the punishments. If you enjoyed this journey into the darker side of history, subscribe to the Grim Archive. New stories every week. And tell me in the comments, which medieval punishment shocked you the most?